very, very warm welcome to our staff and students, and friends, family, donors. It's fantastic to be here for a Burnet Oration. I think the first in probably about 5 years. Normally we hold it every second year or so, but because of COVID, it's been that long, and of course it's very appropriate then that we have the topic that we have today. My name's Brendan Crabb. I'm the director of the Burnet Institute. I know many of you, some of you though I don't. I'll be meeting for the first time, so especially warm welcome to you, and welcome back to those who have been at Burnet things before. Can I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're on, the land of the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects on behalf of us all to their elders past, present and emerging. Can I acknowledge the hurt felt by so many First Nations people with the rejection of the Voice to Parliament vote. Pat Anderson, an academic who's known to many of us in Australia, an elder, an author of the Uluru Statement of the Heart. There's a lovely little clip out there that I'd suggest you Google and watch. She's not one for hyperbole, but she speaks of rejection, of the deep sense of hurt that has lingered. The majority of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people did vote for the Voice. And then she spends the rest of it remarkably talking about the partnership that First Nations Australians now have with so many in Australia who stood up with them. And it's such an inspiring, it's very difficult to watch, but in the end, it's inspiring. And that's what we have to take forward as a community. Anyway, we voted as individuals. There is that hurt felt. There is a need for reconciliation. There is a need for a new way forward. And we're at a juncture now where we have to find that way. We can't just put it behind us. So let's accept that generosity of spirit that hand that Pat reached out to us all. This is the Burnet Oration, named of course after our institute, but really after Macfarlane Burnet himself, the person whose name we have taken or adopted 35 plus years ago. When he died, it was the same time this institute was born out of the Fairfield Hospital that was closing down, the Fairfield Infectious Diseases Hospital. A story that Ian Gust, our founding director, who's here, could tell much better than I can. But especially given the sorts of things that we do at the Institute, and of course the topic for tonight, talking about a virus and its illness, and immunity to that virus, good and failing, is exactly what Macfarlane Burnet did. He won a Nobel Prize for his work on tolerance. Could have easily won immunological tolerance, could have easily won a Nobel Prize or two more, especially for his work on counting viruses, which is a hard thing to do. So really inspiring figure, and this is the most prestigious lecture that we have to honour his memory. And it's not always a scientist who delivers it or someone who works as a researcher who delivers it. The last orator, I think, was our former Governor-General, Dame Quentin Bryce. She certainly gave it. I think it was the last one. And introduced by another lawyer, our governor at the time, Linda Dessau, AC. It was a fantastic evening speaking about things that are important to us, in that case, women's and children's health. So it's very prestigious to us. It's meant to be very accessible, and I know that tonight's speakers are brilliant at doing that. You don't have to be an expert in the field to get something out of tonight. I'm going to begin by showing a little video clip because you'll notice that a few of us in orange. This is basically the uniform now. We spent a little bit of time thinking hard, the board and management, about a better way to tell our message. The Burnet Institute is an unusual place. We started off as a virology institute, but really we're a mix between trying to find technical solutions to challenging health problems, particularly infectious diseases and more non-infectious diseases, particularly general issues of maternal and child adolescent health, drugs and alcohol and so on, especially in resource-poor settings or in very at-risk communities. And the approaches we take are both technical and non-technical. And when I say non-technical, I really mean addressing the fact that much of the poor health in that space is because our approach to health is fundamentally unfair, that there's an inequity between those who are rich and poor, or those for whatever reason have versus those that have not. And the Institute tries to work at the intersection. You need both of those things. I personally work on malaria. It's a technically challenging problem. We don't have the understanding that we need to make the tools we need. So you've got to do that. But that won't be enough to deliver those solutions to the people who need it most. So we had to think about how we tell our story through our brand with that in mind. So, Angus, could I have the little video, please?
It's time to reach higher, towards learning, towards understanding, towards innovation. It's time to reach further, beyond borders, beyond empty promises, towards those too often forgotten. It's time to reach deeper, beyond prejudice, beyond injustice, towards a safer, healthier world. Because health equity will only truly exist when science reaches far beyond race, gender, sexuality, religion, and wealth. That's where every one of us at Burnet puts our focus. Every single day. Reaching higher in everything we do. To reach her. To reach him. To reach them. So that no one is ever out of reach again. We are Burnet, and we are here to reach for the many.
Oh, thank you very much. And so with that sort of backdrop as to where we are coming from, I'd like to introduce sort of today's topic and two speakers. And first say that in your program you'll have Monique Ryan. Monique is actually unwell, and so I'm going to introduce a replacement for Monique. Oh, sorry, Bronwyn, to describe you as a replacement for... I'll make it sound much better in a moment. But it won't be Monique, it will be Bronwyn. It's hard to know how to quite capture the last nearly 4 years without sounding trite. What's happened with COVID, whether we directly suffered from it or not, is that it was a deeply traumatic experience for the world. It has, as a health challenge, set the world back like nothing else in 70 years or more. It set public health back. We've seen continual improvement in the indicators, especially in the developed world, but actually in the developing world as well. Low and middle income and low income countries have seen continuous improvement in the main for the best part of 70 years, with a glitch in Africa, largely with the last pandemic, interestingly enough, with HIV/AIDS. It's profoundly affected the world. 25 plus million people have died. We're going to hear about other impacts of that today. The challenge goes on. The cost of the pandemic is in the trillions of dollars. Without action, the World Bank estimates we still have 10 to 13 or so trillion dollars to go. Remember, the economy of the whole world is about $100 trillion just in the next few years. Profoundly impactful. We're 4 years in, though, and we're in another wave as we speak, and the challenge goes on. In Australia, and in much of the world, but particularly in Australia, we have a focus on acute disease, on acute illness. Understandable. What takes people to hospital, what kills people before their time. In Australia, it's still occurring at the rate of about 10% extra death each year than we would normally have, driven by COVID. Of course, we care a lot about that. But it's turned out that that's only part of the story. And that's really the topic for today, without stealing the thunder of our speakers any further. And that problem is profound, it's huge, it's mixed with what we know and what we scarily don't know but are worried about with respect to what's there now, what's baked in, and what might happen in the future without the right sort of intervention. It's with what we know in the Western world, because we have much better data and access to data. It's what we don't know in the developing world. Except we know enough to know it's likely to be even worse in those settings than it is in this setting. So really difficult, sobering topic, but we are going to, hopefully it's going to be informative and leave you inspired with what can be done from here. And I'm going to begin by introducing our first speaker, who is Dr. Bronwyn King, AO. I've got to know Bronwyn pretty well in the last 3 or 4 months, certainly last year, but especially in the last 3 or 4 months. She's kind of been tutoring me in sort of international relations and other things. Thank you, Bronwyn. She can tell her story to a bit. I definitely don't want to steal her thunder, but a really inspiring journey herself, from clinical oncologist to tobacco-free fame. If there's anyone who's done more in this country to drive a tobacco-free world, in the world, not just in this country, than Bronwyn, I don't know who that person is. And I've watched Bronwyn in action, as I recently did in New York, at the UN General Assembly meetings that we were jointly at. And there isn't a health minister and a company CEO in the world who doesn't know Bronwyn on speed dial. And they come to see how that they can improve the policy settings, and particularly the corporate settings in their space, so that they can be tobacco free. She's very cleverly linked up financial success with public health. And then it's got an interesting COVID, and that's a story I'm not going to tell, but boy, do we need that expertise applied to this field. Bronwyn has many things, not just to her belt. She's an Olympic swimmer. She's a doctor of the Olympic swimming team. After that, she was appointed an Officer of the Order of Australia, and she's been Melburnian of the Year in 2020. In 2022, just last year, she accepted the WHO Director General Special Award for Global Tobacco Control on behalf of the organisation that she founded and runs, Tobacco Free Portfolios. She's been doing some work on the side for a little while now, bringing sort of a some general advice to us as to how to move forward on COVID, but particularly and the link to tobacco with respect to clean air and the importance of clean air. The reason we have purifiers here, the reason we're in this room, which is has good mechanical ventilation, is the future of COVID control, and Bronwyn has been a really inspiring driver of that. Can you please warmly welcome Dr. Bronwyn King.
Thank you, Brendan, for that very kind and slightly exaggerated introduction. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is such a pleasure to be here this evening. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet this evening and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. As Brenda mentioned, so I'm a radiation oncologist by background. I am a public health enthusiast, and I've had a very keen interest in the pandemic from the very first few days of 2020. Here I've only got 5 minutes, and my job here tonight is to actually tell my story, my personal story. I wish I didn't have a personal story, but I do have a personal story about long COVID. And I'd like to sort of share that story through the lens of I hate that I'm middle-aged, but a middle-aged woman who was otherwise fit and well. I got COVID in February 2022. So just, sort of think, 18, 19 months ago. Previously fit, well, no medical problems at all, and I'd had 3 vaccines. Like many parents of primary school children, I got COVID because my boys brought COVID home to us. The first week was unremarkable. I was a bit off, it wasn't too bad. The second week I thought I was recovering well, and the third week I sort of started back at work. It was a Monday morning. I'd worked between, say, 8:30 and 11, and I distinctly remember 11 a.m. because 11 a.m. that day, week 3, I was just overcome with a profound fatigue. It was really unlike anything I'd ever had, and I worked from home. And I thought, you know what, I've just got to go to bed. Now, I had the presence of mind to set my alarm for 3 p.m. because that day I was picking up my boys from school. And so I knew I was feeling really dull and heavy and unwell. And I'm glad I set the alarm because I fell asleep immediately and I woke up right on 3 to this alarm. And I was just in the heaviest, deepest sleep, and I dragged myself out of bed to go and pick up my boys. I got home. I remember staggering in the house, saying to the boys, "You do whatever you like, I'm going straight back to bed." And I just sort of crawled into bed. And I did that pretty much every day for the next 3 months. That's how I lived. I slept for between 4 and 7 hours during the day, every day. I slept all night. Every day I suffered from palpitations. I had a racing heart. Sometimes my heart I swear it would sort of stop for a bit and then start up again with some thunderous deep beats. And I had frequent nausea, so a couple of times a week. And there were a couple of episodes that were I don't really know how to describe them except for saying that there were 2 episodes I distinctly remember during that time period where I thought I was just going to drop dead. I just sort of went lightheaded and I thought, wow, gosh, this could be it. And both of those episodes took me, really the whole day to recover from. I just felt absolutely dreadful. Now, during that time, I reached out for help. It was difficult to get help. Obviously, I'm extremely medically literate. I know how the healthcare system works. For me, it was very difficult to get help. When I could get help, there was a very long wait. There was a long wait to see anybody, a long wait to see the GP, a long wait to see a cardiologist. There were long COVID clinics, but a long wait everywhere. And then when I was ordered tests, there was a long wait for the tests as well. And then all the tests came through. Most of them were normal, except for my heart tests. I had a new arrhythmia. But I got to the end of it, and then there was no treatment. There was nothing. So there was no treatment to offer me. There was no support services. There were no research trials. There was nothing. Everybody just said, look, go away. You'll probably be right at some point. Just go away. And for me, that was extremely disappointing and deflating to think that that was the best we could do in Australia, in a very wealthy country. And as a cancer doctor, I'm so proud of all of the cancer services we have. I can stand here with my hand on my heart and say we have the world's best cancer services to offer right here in Melbourne, Australia. And yet here I was needing some help, and I just felt completely let down. Now, I was very lucky. I did recover. Around the sort of 4-month mark, I started to recover gradually, and over time, I have made what I think is a pretty close to full recovery. I'm doing all my normal things now. I'm still not as fit as I was because I'm nervous to exercise. I still do a little bit, but I don't think I'll ever do full-on cardiovascular exercise anymore because I'm just a bit nervous about that dropping dead thing. That is my story. I acknowledge that many people with long COVID don't recover or haven't yet recovered, but I do just want to share that story so that I can share some of the key messages that the experience has really taught me. And I've got 4 messages for you. This is really for the health community and for the media, but also for the public more generally. My message number 1 is, please listen to patients who are suffering from long COVID. Listen to them. Don't deny their symptoms or downplay their symptoms, and please do not tell them it is in their head or some kind of mental disorder. Listen to patients and believe them. Number 2, learn more. Learn more about long COVID. It's very frustrating that we don't know more when we've got hundreds of thousands of people right here in Australia suffering from various forms of long COVID. We've got tens of millions of people all around the world. Study them, reach out to them, get them on clinical trials, research, and really prioritise that amongst any of the groups where you have influence. Now, the third one, because I was going with the L theme, listen, learn. The third one is love. Give some love to COVID patients, because I can tell you firsthand it's very deflating when there's very little support out there. Sometimes in the community, people aren't even being believed. So if you know anyone with long COVID in your community, please be kind, be considerate, support them and show them some love and care. And my final one is lower your risk. Lower your risk of long COVID. You don't want long COVID. The best way to prevent long COVID is to not get COVID. COVID is airborne. You get COVID by breathing in viral particles in the air. So everywhere you go, try to make sure you are breathing clean air. So by that I mean do everything outdoor that you can. I know it's easy on a beautiful day like today in Melbourne to say that, but try to do everything outdoor when you can. When you have to be indoor, open the doors and windows, use air purifiers when you can, and if all else fails, make sure you wear an N95 mask, a proper mask. I mean, they're technically in medicine, they're called respirators, but if you want to say it a different way, an N95 mask. And for the community more broadly, we need to encourage our leaders to adopt indoor air quality standards so that we can be guaranteed that we are breathing clean air indoors. As Brenda mentioned, we've been working with a big community in Australia to try to advance this. There are 15 countries around the world that have made progress on clean indoor air standards this year, and we really want to see Australia do the same thing so that we can safeguard the long-term health of all Australians. So those are my messages. Listen to long COVID patients and believe them. Learn more and commit to prioritising research. Share the love and help support long COVID patients, and do everything you can to lower your risk. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bronwyn. The 4 L's, and to hear, it's nothing like hearing from someone who's suffered from it, and it makes such a difference to any storytelling. So thank you so much, Bronwyn, for giving us that personal story today. I've already mentioned, I've tried to not steal any thunder, and I know Bronwyn hasn't either, just with a few numbers there. But one of the biggest reasons we know anything about numbers, risk of reinfection, damage to various parts of the body, likelihood of getting better or not getting better, is because of the work of our next speaker and his team at St Louis. So it's my very great pleasure to say a few words now to introduce our speaker tonight. Ziyad gave a talk at Burnet today, and in it he mentioned Taylor Swift. I don't know if you're going to mention Taylor Swift again, because I might have just stolen that thunder. But in our world, Ziyad is the Taylor Swift that my daughters and me secretly also live in admiration of. He's a physician-scientist himself, and he directs the Clinical Epidemiology Centre and the Chief of Research and Development at the Veterans Affairs St Louis healthcare system. The Veterans Affairs bit is really important because apart from being completely brilliant, as you'll hear a bit tonight, I think they have the most amazing group of people really who contribute their health information, US veterans, to these studies. That's actually how we know so much. And I'm not even going to mention the numbers because it's so mind-boggling you've got to hear it directly from Ziyad. But this very carefully curated and enormous number of people contributing their health information is the secret sauce here that goes with the brilliant minds that Ziyad and his team bring. He's led work which really provided the systematic characterisation of, we call long COVID, but post-acute sequelae of SARS-CoV-2 infection is how it's more technically known, and it's a complex spectrum of things, as you'll hear a bit tonight. Characterisation of increased risks of cardiovascular disease, of neurological complications and disorders, of diabetes, of kidney disease, gastrointestinal disease, and so on. His lab, as you'll hear a bit tonight, but I can emphasise, is the first to produce evidence of the effects of vaccines on long COVID, the positive effects of vaccines on long COVID. I'm going to emphasise at the end why this is so important. It's not a part of our policy in Australia, and I'll emphasise why that's really significant. Then, of course, this issue of repeated infections. For those who don't live and breathe this world, you think, okay, if I'm unlucky enough to get an infection and survive it okay, at least I'm going to be protected for the next time, right? It's not the case. It's not the story at all when it comes to long COVID. And how do we know that? You're going to find out that, and what does that mean? And of course, also the effect of antiviral drugs on the short and long-term outcomes of SARS-CoV-2 infections. These are like the biggest questions in COVID research, especially to do with chronic disease, and Ziyad's group's been at the leading edge of those. Dr Ziyad Al-Aly, he's co-chaired the Biden-Harris administration committee that developed the National Research Action Plan for long COVID. He serves on the US government interagency long COVID Council. He's advised the Chief Science Advisor of Canada, the government of Justin Trudeau, and he serves on a consensus committee at the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine, looking at the long-term health effects of, that come from COVID-19 and their implication, in fact, for social security. It's really, if we had to choose a person from anywhere in the world to come and tell us about long COVID, it would be Ziyad. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the podium, Dr Ziyad Al-Aly.
Really, thank you very much for the warm introduction, and really delighted to be here, delighted to be in Australia, and specifically in Melbourne, and visiting Burnet. And we had a really wonderful visit today, connecting with the mission of Burnet and really improving healthcare and health around the world and leaving no one behind. So thank you for what you do at Burnet and the opportunity to talk to you today about long COVID. So what I'm going to talk to you today is a bit of a story, and I'm going to tell you a story. Why did we, as a bunch of clinical epidemiologists in St. Louis, in the middle of the country, decided to embark on a journey of trying to understand what long COVID is? And that story goes back to March 2020. And I do remember very, very, very vividly, all of a sudden in March 2020 in the US, cases were skyrocketing, people were being hospitalized, and the number of deaths or death rate started to climb dramatically in March 2020. All of a sudden, there were lockdowns, people were told to go home, you can no longer travel, you can no longer, even go to Starbucks, even go to the coffee shop. Everything was closed. Our lives were upended and literally was sort of upside down in the span of very few days in March 2020. So we really saw a world in crisis. We were in crisis in the United States, and we saw all around us, in Italy, in Wuhan, in China, and elsewhere in the world, we saw a world in crisis. And we decided right there and then that we're going to devote our energy and our resources at the St. Louis VA in the clinical epicenter to try to help out, to pitch in and do our part to help out. And we wanted to do that by identifying questions that are really important to the public, people like you, who are like, oh, does COVID really matter? What is reinfection risk, et cetera, et cetera. At that time, obviously, we didn't know any of that. But what we wanted to do, we wanted to identify questions that are important to the public and address them scientifically as rigorously as possible. And I do remember at the time, and I think that's really, really important, in the annals of medicine, in the history books, when people are going to write history, the history books about the pandemic and COVID and long COVID, this is really a landmark sort of a op-ed piece in the New York Times that I remember vividly seeing it or reading it for the first time on my couch in St. Louis at night on my laptop, reading Fiona Lowenstein. I did not know her at the time. Now we're very, very close friends, but at that time I did not know her at all. And she was basically telling us that everybody at the time was telling people that if you were young and healthy, and if you had COVID-19, you'll bounce back in a day or two or three as if nothing has happened. You'll recover very quickly. But she was saying, I'm young, previously healthy, did not have any medical problems, got SARS-CoV-2 several weeks ago, and now, several weeks later, I still have lingering problems, lingering shortness of breath, lingering fatigue, brain fog, et cetera, et cetera. So something is happening. Somebody is not telling us exactly what the long-term consequences of SARS-CoV-2. And I do remember very vividly the aha moment here. This is really the index case of what long COVID is. And it did not come in the form of a paper or a case report in the New England Journal of Medicine or JAMA or The Lancet, one of those nice scientific publications. It literally came in the form of an op-ed piece in New York Times. This is in the history of long COVID. This is really the index case. This is the first one that's been described in a written publication. And to their credit, the people who had similar experiences, the people who had very, very similar experiences to Fiona, said, me too. There was really, you can think of another Me Too movement. It's like, oh, me too, that's my experience too. I'm also 26 years old. I've been previously healthy. I got COVID-19 8 or 9 weeks ago, and I'm still suffering lingering problems. And they did not leave it at that. They absolutely did not leave it at that. They actually coalesced around each other and formed patient groups and patient advocacy groups, the most known of which is the Patient-Led Research Collaborative. And these are the heroes. If you're looking for heroes of the pandemic or heroes of long COVID or heroines of long COVID, these are the people who really changed the arc of history and alerted us, our team, and the rest of the world that long COVID exists. These people are suffering. And then we needed to devote attention to try to better understand what's going on. So what Patient-Led Research Collaborative did was really genius. At that time, they did not have access to large databases or anything like that, but they surveyed their membership. At that time, they had about 600 people in their group. They sent an online survey, and they surveyed their membership. And what they told us at the time, that their membership, these people, mostly young women, mostly young, who had no medical problems before SARS-CoV-2 infection. Weeks or months after the initial infection with SARS-CoV-2, they were still reporting weakness, fatigue, brain fog, and multiple other manifestations. And to their credit again, they actually coined the term of the disease, the name for the disease. They called it long COVID. And the person who coined it was Elisa Perago, an Italian archaeologist. She's the first person to actually call it long COVID in a tweet. That's really the first known use in the history of our civilization, the first known use of the term long COVID. So long COVID was not a term that was coined by NIH or any scientist or Anthony Fauci or anyone else. It was actually coined by a patient with a lived experience of long COVID. And that's really Elisa Perago from Italy, an Italian archaeologist. And they started referring to themselves as long haulers. So at the time, knowing that we wanted to sort of devote ourselves to trying to help out, to pitch in and do our part in addressing the challenges that this global crisis brought. So we started asking the question, what are these people talking about? What is long COVID? What is it? And we knew at the time that they did that survey, but their survey was an uncontrolled experiment. It did not have a control group. So we literally decided to do the rigorous scientific experiment to answer the question, what is long COVID? And this is really our earliest study on long COVID. So what we found that long COVID can affect nearly every organ system. We looked at the heart, we looked at the lungs, we looked at the kidneys. We saw increased risk of diabetes, mental health disorders, blood clotting problems. We saw increased risk in nearly every organ system. So, literally every organ system. Well, we also saw that the magnitude of risk was what we saw here. What we did here, we also did. Sort of at that time, we were thinking, well, SARS-CoV-2 is a virus, but there are also a lot of other viruses around, including the flu or seasonal influenza. So we did the experiment to compare COVID-19 versus seasonal influenza. What we really found here was that the magnitude of risk in COVID-19 was higher than the flu, meaning that it's really it increases the risk of all these problems in to a much higher degree than what you get with seasonal influenza or with the flu. We also found that the breadth of organ involvement in SARS-CoV-2 infection was much higher than what you get with seasonal influenza. So we concluded at the time that yes, with flu, people sometimes can also get sick, and we've known this for 50 years or actually even longer. But SARS-CoV-2 is really a different, or presents or leads to a different kind of post-viral illness. Two key differentiating features. The risk is higher with COVID than with the flu. Don't let anybody convince you otherwise. The risk is higher with COVID than the flu. That's what the science says. That's what the data says. And the breadth of organ involvement is much more extensive with SARS-CoV-2 infection or with COVID-19 than seasonal influenza. What we also saw, and I think it was really very, very, very important, that the risk was evident even in people who had mild disease. And why this is really important, why this statement is profoundly important, because most of people on Earth, most of the people you know, most of your neighbors, most of your friends, most of your family members, when they actually get COVID-19, luckily, they get the mild variety or mild COVID-19 that does not necessitate hospitalization. We call that mild, and although it can actually be really quite people can be sick for a week or 2 or 3, but we still call that mild because it does not lead to hospitalization. Even in people who have mild disease, which is the majority of people on Earth, when they get SARS-CoV-2 infection, they get mild disease. Even in these individuals, they can still manifest with increased risk of long COVID. The risk, however, is much higher, really much, much higher in people who are hospitalized for COVID-19, or even higher, or even sort of much, much higher than that in people who needed ICU care or needed admission to the intensive care unit as a result of COVID-19. So now you tell me, like, okay, well, like you told us, like, it really, affects nearly every organ system and affects the kidneys and the heart and the brain and can lead to diabetes and blood clotting disorders, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So do people usually, have all these manifestations? And the answer is absolutely no. So, and New York Times printed on one time one of the it's sort of articles on long COVID that if you've seen one patient with long COVID, you've seen one patient with long COVID. If I wanted to take one thing from this lecture is that long COVID is non-monolithic in the sense that not every case is the same. It's really very heterogeneous and can present in multiple different ways in multiple individuals. So it's truly a non-monolithic entity. And we wanted in our research team to try to focus on things or sequelae or consequences of SARS-CoV-2 that really we thought sort of could lead to higher burden of chronic disease, including cardiovascular disorders, these are heart problems, diabetes, kidney disease, neurologic disorders, and gastrointestinal disorders. We started looking at the heart, and this is really our earliest study looking specifically at cardiovascular disorders in people with SARS-CoV-2 infection. What we did here, we assembled a cohort of about 150,000 people from the Veterans Administration. We compared them to nearly 11 million controls. About 5.5 million people who lived during the same time period, meaning that they were exposed to broader contextual conditions of the pandemic, lived during the same time period as those infected with SARS-CoV-2. And another 5.5 million people of individuals who were recruited before the pandemic started. We call that a historical control. So those people could not have had SARS-CoV-2 infection because SARS-CoV-2 infection did not exist on Earth in 2017 or 2018. So that's a historical control. When we compare infected people to these two controls, what we really saw, we saw increased risk of a variety of heart problems, including fast heart rate, slow heart rate, heart attacks, strokes, including large strokes or TIAs or like transient or really mini, what we call mini strokes. We saw increased risk of heart failure, cardiac arrest, and thrombotic disorders or blood clotting disorders. And that's really important because it's not really limited to one heart manifestations. SARS-CoV-2 infection in the long term, up to a year after infection, can lead to increased risk in all these domains of the heart. And again, what we saw that people who had mild disease, people who had mild COVID-19, had increased risk of these heart problems, although the risk increased in a graded fashion according to the severity. But it's very, very important. This group in green is really the most important group, because while the risk is low here, those actually represent the majority of people in the world. And the risk is low on the relative scale, but if you multiply this by the number of people who had SARS-CoV-2 infection in the world, that translates literally into hundreds of millions of people potentially impacted with these conditions. And then we wanted to address the question, well, we're talking about heart problems here, but we also know that heart problems usually manifest in people who have high cholesterol, people who had obesity, people who had high blood pressure. And is this really happening in that high-risk group only? And the answer is no. It did not matter if you're young or old. It did not matter if you're black or white. It did not matter if you had obesity or didn't have obesity, smoked or didn't smoke, had high blood pressure or didn't have high blood pressure, had diabetes or didn't have diabetes, had chronic kidney disease, hyperlipidemia, or cardiovascular, or you did not have any of these conditions. There was increased risk of heart problems from SARS-CoV-2 infection up to a year after the initial infection. And that's really remarkable because for the first time in our sort of medical history, now, well, not the first time, for the first time recently, now we have a new risk factor for cardiovascular disease. Having had SARS-CoV-2 infection, and I know a lot of the people in the world have had a SARS-CoV-2 infection, now represents a risk factor for development of new onset heart problems, even in people who did not or do not have risk factors for it. So this is really a new or an additional risk factor. We also saw increased risk of diabetes, and that actually was also a revelation very early on in the pandemic, and that people with SARS-CoV-2 infection were developing increased risk of diabetes in the year that followed the initial infection. Not only diabetes, but also hyperlipidemia or high cholesterol, and that included high HDL, low HDL, high LDL or low density cholesterol, the bad cholesterol, and then low levels of the good cholesterol, HDL levels. And then we sort of switch our attention a little bit to try to better understand what's happening in the kidneys. What we saw here is really, really important. We managed to plot or try to estimate kidney function trajectories over the year that follows the initial infection. So these are kidney function trajectories in the year that follows the initial infection. What we saw is that people who had SARS-CoV-2 infection compared to people who did not get SARS-CoV-2 infection had an increased risk of kidney problems. But not only that, they also manifested with a decline in kidney function that is commensurate with about 4 years of aging. So how do you interpret this data? Well, we interpreted it as that these people actually aged, their kidneys aged about 4 years in the span of just one. Their kidneys aged 4 years in the span of just one. So you can start thinking or conceptualizing, SARS-CoV-2 infection as a form of something that sort of pushes you along the trajectory of aging. It's an accelerant of aging, or it's sort of it accelerates the underlying aging process. These people, their kidneys aged 4 years in the span of just one, or lost kidney function, that people normally it takes them 4 years to lose. And then what about the mental health of people with SARS-CoV-2 infection? And is that really a component of long COVID? And we started here with the really sort of the broad observation that all of us during the pandemic, we endured some form of stress, right? The pandemic itself was a major stressor. So all of us during this pandemic endured some form of stress. But we asked the question, do people with SARS-CoV-2 infection have it worse? Do people with SARS-CoV-2 infection have a higher risk of mental health problems? And then the answer is clearly yes. We've seen that sort of very, very clearly in the data, that compared to both contemporary controls, people who lived during the same time period as the infected group, but did not have SARS-CoV-2 infection, and compared to a historical control group from an era that predated the pandemic, those infected, people who got infected, manifested with increased risk of a variety of mental health problems, including depression, anxiety, sleep problems, cognition disorders, and sort of in some cases panic attacks, et cetera, et cetera. So it was very, very clearly that SARS-CoV-2 infection can lead to neurologic and mental health manifestations. And here's sort of the paper on neurologic disorders. We wanted to understand a little bit more deeply how COVID affects the brain. And by the time we did this paper, and Evan Shu from my team sort of led the work on this, what we wanted to try to, map all the different consequences of SARS-CoV-2 infection in the brain. And we use our typical approach, enrolling about 150,000 people with SARS-CoV-2 infection, and then comparing them to about 11 million people who at the time did not get infected with SARS-CoV-2. What we saw increased risk of a variety of brain problems. This is quite something. That wasn't really only strokes, or it wasn't really only headaches or epilepsy. It was really a lot of brain problems. All of this is really here was, and sort of an increased risk of strokes or mini strokes, increased risk of peripheral neuropathy, increased risk of what we call episodic disorders, headache disorders, or epilepsy, increased risk of inflammation of the brain, really a variety of problems in the brain in people with SARS-CoV-2 infection. This is really up to a year after the initial infection. So it's very, very clearly that this is not a respiratory virus. And the SARS and the R in SARS is for respiratory. But please don't really think of it as a respiratory virus. It's truly, genuinely is a multisystemic virus that can affect nearly every organ system, including the heart and also including the brain. And this is the last slide for organ system. Then I will switch gear to a different part of the talk. We also saw increased risk of gastrointestinal problems, of GI problems, including constipation, diarrhea, irritable bowel syndrome, et cetera, et cetera. So what I shared with you so far, several things. One, that SARS-CoV-2 infection in the year that follows the onset of infection, or the date of infection, can result in increased risk, substantially increased risk of cardiovascular problems, heart problems, diabetes, and high cholesterol, increased risk of kidney problems, increased risk of neurologic and mental health disorders, and increased risk of gastrointestinal disorders. But you could say, well, you know what, you're telling us all of this, but you know what, I had COVID before, and I did just fine. So should I worry about reinfection? So, I think one of my patients really sort of characterizes really best. I dodged the bullet previously. What are my chances upon reinfection? And we did this work because at the time, a lot of patients, not as wise as the patient that I just quoted, but came to the clinic and started telling us that, they feel almost invincible, that they've been infected before and they literally dodged the bullet. Nothing really happened to them. They did not end up with long COVID. And they were also vaccinated. And then the proper term for this, we refer to them as people with hybrid immunity, meaning that they have immunity from vaccines, vaccine-derived immunity. They also have immunity from a natural infection because they had SARS-CoV-2 before. So they have hybrid immunity. Unfortunately, some in the press started referring to this as super immunity, people start feeling invincible. Like, I have this super immunity. I have this really intense form of immunity that's going to protect me from the consequences of reinfection. So should you worry about reinfection? And the data is very, very clear that not only a first infection can lead to long COVID, but also people can get long COVID upon a second infection. And we did the analysis to try to understand this quantitatively. So even if people dodged the bullet the first time and did not get long COVID, reinfection contributes additional risks of long COVID, meaning that upon reinfection, people can still get long COVID. And to also put it a little bit in another way, 2 infections are worse than 1, and 3 are worse than 2. So do your best to try to avoid being reinfected, because reinfection is absolutely not inconsequential. You may have dodged the bullet the first time and avoided, or did not have long COVID, or did not have any consequences of the first infection. And that's great, and it's really wonderful, but it may not be the case every time you get long COVID. You may actually get long COVID the second time around or the third time around. The risk upon 2 infections is worse than 1, and 3 are certainly worse than 2. And then one of the questions that we got really asked by the patient community again, so we really defer to them a lot, sort of like trying to, identify the questions that are really most important to the public. So I asked, how long is long COVID? They actually were prophetic by calling it long COVID. And the answer is long COVID is long, is really, really long. Here is an analysis also containing people who are non-hospitalized and people who are hospitalized. What we really show here is that people who are non-hospitalized for SARS-CoV-2 infection, that represents the majority of people on Earth, majority of people in the audience, majority of people in Melbourne, in Australia, the majority of people in the world. 2 years out, they were still suffering or still at risk of about a third of the 80 problems that we identified in long COVID. Long COVID can generate a lot of problems. We've identified about 80. And we mapped the risk trajectory here over time of these individuals. What we saw that these people remained at increased risk of about a third of the problems 2 years out. The picture was even more stark in people who had been hospitalized for SARS-CoV-2 infection. They were at increased risk of about 2/3 of these problems, of these 80 sequelae or 80 health problems that we identified. So I'd like to say that really the patient community were actually again prophetic, and we really saw it from even March 2020 and April 2020 and May of 2020 when they called it long COVID. So the risk trajectory, or the how long is long COVID, it's really, really long. So what can we do to prevent long COVID? And I think really it's beautifully answered by Dr. King. And the best way on earth to prevent long COVID is to prevent COVID in the first place. There's actually no long COVID without COVID. Long COVID would not exist in our language. Long COVID would not exist on Earth had it not been for SARS-CoV-2 infection. If we did not have SARS-CoV-2 infection, we would not have long COVID. So there's absolutely no long COVID without COVID. The best way to prevent long COVID is to prevent COVID in the first place. And prevention or infection prevention is a multi-pronged approach. Say masking when possible. Be strategic about where you go out to dinner. The weather is really good outside. If you're offered the chance to dine outside or inside, choose to dine outside. It's definitely less risk than being indoor. Now, number 2 is trying to emphasize the importance of ventilation and air purification and clean air indoors. That's really, really very important. And we sort of feel very strongly about this because we feel that we design buildings to be, seismically, proof for earthquakes that happen maybe once every 25, 50, or 100 years. And that costs actually a lot of money. it's actually, believe it or not, it costs a lot of money to design buildings to withstand the shake of an earthquake. So why can't we design buildings that are also safe to be at, not only, in everyday life and also during the new pandemics, or especially if their pathogens are airborne. So the third component is really to try to encourage the development of new vaccines, especially mucosal vaccines to block infection. Our current vaccine approaches do not do that. The current vaccines are very, very good and very, very pro-vaccine, but it's very, very important to understand what they do and what they don't do. Current vaccine technologies reduce the risk of severe disease, reduce the risk of hospitalization, reduce the risk of death, and reduce the risk of long COVID. They don't block the infection very well. But we know of technologies that could be developed and scaled up, including vaccines that induce strong mucosal immunity to block infection and prevent transmission. And I think that's really one of the ways to go in this multi-pronged approach. And there's also the story of antivirals. We know antivirals really work in preventing long COVID. But also I worry that we have too few antivirals, especially when we have a rising specter of antiviral resistance. Viruses, like bacteria, are actually smart, and they actually evolve in a way that could make them immune or could make them resistant to existing antivirals. And I really think that the world should not rely upon one or two antivirals. That's really a mistake to put all our eggs in these two baskets, like, say Paxlovid or Molnupiravir or Remdesivir. I think we need to expand our pipeline of antivirals. This is really, really very important. SARS-CoV-2 is not going to go away. It's unlikely to go away anytime soon. It probably will be here maybe for tens of years, if not hundreds of years. And we need to be able to develop a pipeline of antivirals that's going to outsmart the virus, not really be reactive to it, and fall and potentially allow the virus to develop resistance to the existing pipeline of antivirals, where we literally would find ourselves back in 2020 where we have no antivirals that work. So I think that's really very, very, very important. So what are the mechanisms of long COVID? So long COVID is really new, and we're trying to understand why long COVID really happens. One of the leading hypotheses of long COVID is that the virus really never completely, or the body never completely eradicates the virus from the body, and then the virus persists in quote unquote immune privileged sites. And that viral persistence, it does not have to be the full virus, the full live replicating virus. It can actually be viral protein or fragments. That viral persistence of these viral proteins or fragments can actually trigger low-grade inflammation and subsequently organ injury. This is one of the hypotheses, and I think it's a promising hypothesis, but we'd like to sort of see more empiric evidence to help us more deeply understand what's going on, the mechanism here. The second mechanism is microbiome dysbiosis, the idea that within us there are literally trillions of bacterial cells, actually outnumbering human cells. And these bacterial cells, they get also affected by SARS-CoV-2 infection. When we get sick by SARS-CoV-2, they also get sick, and they may not recover. So we may not recover fully, from that SARS-CoV-2 infection. That causes disturbance in the microbiome, those trillions of cells that live within us, and that disturbance itself is what leads to disease. Other hypotheses revolve around immunity, whether it is strong immunity, hyperimmune response, or immunity directed towards self. We call that autoimmunity, where the body starts attacking self, or really a dysfunctional immune response, where it could actually then lead to hypothesis number one, where the body is not mounting enough of a robust immune response to fully clear the virus and the viral fragments that remain. There are other hypotheses revolving around the vagus nerve and also blood clotting. So what about treatment? So I told you a little bit about how to prevent long COVID, talked a little bit about mechanisms. So how do we treat long COVID? And I think this is really an opportunity that needs to be further developed. There's a lot of work that needs to be done here. So this is the number of treatments that have been so far validated and approved in the US or Australia or the UK or Europe for long COVID. You're rating that correctly, 0, none. There is no treatment has been approved for long COVID yet. And I think that's really represents an opportunity, represents, sort of the slowness of the field so far in developing treatments, but also represents an opportunity to mobilize resources in that direction and try to stimulate research to get that number up from zero. We need to find treatment for long COVID. The people who are suffering from long COVID, they deserve treatment yesterday. They really need treatment yesterday. They need and deserve treatment yesterday. And that's very, 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 very important. So when we talk about, COVID-19, most of the press, when they talk about COVID-19, most of our public conversation, when we talk about COVID-19, we talk about the acute cases. We talk about cases. We talk about hospitalization from COVID, and we talk about death. We don't really talk about the long-term consequences of the infection. So what are the long-term consequences? The really chronic disease and disability, as I showed you, it will have an impact on life expectancy. It will erode decades of progress in improving life expectancy. It will have impact, or it has impact on development and educational attainment of kids, of people in school who are not able to do well in school. It has broad economic implications and also social or societal implications. I'm going to end with a couple slides to offer reflections on challenges and opportunities that we've sort of experienced during this pandemic, and then we'll go to a Q&A. So some of the challenges that I think is really characterized the arc of the long COVID story is really that the care of people with long COVID remains suboptimal. Dr. King actually elaborated on this with her story, and thank you again for sharing your story. This is really very much needed to sort of promote awareness that even she is a physician, she's a doctor, she's very, very savvy and is able to navigate, is very savvy and knows the healthcare system in Australia very, very well. Even she had a difficulty finding treatment for long COVID in the UK, in Australia. And that's actually everywhere in the world. That's the same story in the US, the same story in the UK, the same story in Germany, the same story everywhere. So people with long COVID deserve better care, and they're not getting it. They're actually now getting suboptimal care, and that's really very, very important. That it needs to be changed. Prevention strategies are underutilized. We know how to prevent long COVID. We know how to improve our ventilation and air filtration systems. We know how to optimize uptakes of vaccines, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But prevention strategies are significantly underutilized. There is no treatment for long COVID yet, and that's really an important challenge. No consensus on terms and definition. You see, people call it long COVID. Some people call it PASC, or post-acute sequelae of SARS-CoV-2. Other people call it the WHO, the World Health Organization, calls it the post-COVID condition. There's actually no consensus, no universally agreed upon definition and nomenclature for long COVID. That's primarily because of the embryonic nature of the field. Remember, all of this is less than 4 years old. So this is an embryonic field. We're developing our understanding of long COVID. And with that comes initially these multiple nomenclatures and definitions. But as we stand right now, there's no consensus on terms and definitions and clinical endpoints. No systems in place to measure the burden of illness or chronic disease as a result of SARS-CoV-2 infection. We don't know the long-term risks of infection. What are the risks at 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? I recently contributed to a Fortune piece by Carolyn Baker from California talking about the SARS-CoV-2 infection and the risk of cancer. And the answer, we don't know that. We don't know whether SARS-CoV-2 will actually increase the risk of cancer, because cancer is generally a latent manifestation, a manifestation that really takes years to actually happen. So whether SARS-CoV-2 will actually increase the risk of cancer is still not known, or other latent diseases is really not known. And one of the major challenges that we sort of had to deal with over the course of the pandemic is really the politicization of public health. All of a sudden during this pandemic, public health became sort of a very, very, very heavily politicized in the US and elsewhere in the world. There was a lot of misinformation, disinformation, and anti-science movement. But with challenges come also opportunities. So I think one of the beautiful or one of the silver linings of this pandemic is that the historic scale of the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, of the COVID-19 pandemic, presents really a golden opportunity to not only understand long COVID, but also understand the broader field of infection-associated chronic illnesses. Basically to understand how infections can lead to chronic disease. Why would SARS-CoV-2 lead to diabetes? why would COVID-19 leads to heart attacks. And understanding that will not only help us understand the long-term consequences and deal with those of SARS-CoV-2 infection or long COVID, will also help us understand the long-term consequences of other infections or other infection-associated chronic illnesses. And that's really, really very important. I tell people that we already paid a heavy price for this pandemic. Millions of lives lost around the world. Millions of lives lost. We already paid that price. So let's honor those lives lost by learning as much as possible about the tragedy that we just all went through, and then use all that information, all that knowledge to actually deliver better care for the people with long COVID, and also better prepare for the next pandemic. Pandemics are going to happen. This is one of the certainties of life. Pandemics are going to happen. But it's very, very important that we navigate the rough waters of future pandemics in a much, much better way than we did the COVID-19 pandemic. And we can do better, we should do better, we should learn how to do better. And this crisis is really a terrible opportunity to waste. We must not waste it. We must learn as much as possible from this. And the second thing that I really like to point out here as opportunity is really patients as partners. You know, I think really one of the beautiful stories of this pandemic is how patients have risen, you know, from the very early phases of the pandemic and have alerted us that long COVID exists, gave the condition its name, and then alerted the world that you need to mobilize resources and devote attention to understand and research long COVID and help them. And this is really absolutely beautiful, that patients are true partners in this journey. There are a lot of opportunities in trying to, you know, improve prevention, including ventilation and filtration systems. As I said, we could certainly do a better job requiring building codes, requiring new buildings, and then retrofitting older buildings with better ventilation systems. There's no reason why public buildings in the U.S. and Washington, D.C. cannot really do this, or public buildings, you know, in Australia and other countries, you know, can do that. There's no reason why we can't do this. We know how to do this. It's a matter of really prioritizing the health of the people over other priorities. And I think really the importance of vaccines, we definitely need better vaccines, and especially ones that induce mucosal immunity and expand the pipeline of antivirals. And that's really, really very important. I worry a lot about antiviral resistance. I worry a lot about this because really our pipeline or armamentarium of antivirals for COVID-19 now or for SARS-CoV-2 is actually quite limited. And I worry a lot about that. We definitely need to find treatment because currently the treatment for long COVID stands at 0. And we need to evolve our data systems and expertise to really, to really emulate what the VA has been doing for a long time. There is no reason why systems in the U.S. on a national level, you know, other health systems in the U.S. cannot do the same, or systems in Australia and elsewhere cannot do the same. And I think we do better as a nation, we do better as a world together if we have data systems that could be leveraged to address questions in the context of a pandemic, urgently, in near real time. So basically addressing real-time, real-world evidence generation to really inform decision-making by the public and by governments and the public. So in summary, I hope I sort of, gave you a sense that a lot of this work was really inspired by the patient community. Patients inspired us and continue to inspire us to do this work. And really, most of the questions that we answered in these papers are derived from patients, from conversations with patients, from chats with patients on Zoom, on phone, chatting with patients and patient advocacy groups and patient community and learning from them and what worries them, what they want answered. And we go back to the lab and brainstorm about it, do these whiteboard discussion or whiteboard session to try to sort of map the question in a mathematical way that could be addressed rigorously in using our data. I hope I also communicated very clearly that long COVID is not one thing. Long COVID is not only brain fog and fatigue, those can happen, but long COVID is a multisystemic disease that can affect nearly every organ system. And even people who had mild SARS-CoV-2 infection can actually get long COVID. As a matter of fact, the majority of people with long COVID in the world have actually had mild infection. The majority of people who who had long COVID in the world, who have long COVID now in the world, have actually mild infection. They did not get severe disease or were hospitalized for it or were in the ICU. The majority of people with long COVID actually had mild infection. It is very, very important to deliver better care to our patients. Patients are suffering and they need care, and that really cannot come any sooner. And that really should come in the form of post-acute COVID care strategies that are multi-pronged and able to address the patient needs. We've made some progress on prevention, need trials for treatment. There is a lot of my talks sort of revolve around the viruses, SARS-CoV-2 as almost as an exemplar. It's unique and it's not. SARS-CoV-2 is unique because of the scale of the pandemic and the novelty of SARS-CoV-2, but it's not just another virus. Viruses can cause chronic illnesses, and we need to better understand the link between infectious diseases and chronic illnesses, and offer some reflections on lessons learned. And last but not least, I really wanted to say a big thank you to the long haulers, the people with long COVID, especially the advocacy groups that really helped us and helped shape our thinking and our research agenda over the past several years, who really, literally, they inspired us and continue to inspire us to do this work. And really, my colleague, Yan Shea, there are a lot of team members here, but I'd like to highlight especially one, Yan Shea, who's now the director of pharmacoepi program in our center, who's done actually a lot of the work that I showed you today. And also Miao Kai, the amazing Miao Kai, Evan Shu, Taeyang Choi, and Benjamin Bo. He goes by Charlie Bo. These are absolutely amazing people, stellar people who really work very hard over the course of the pandemic to deliver all this work in a timely fashion. Other members who are not directly involved with the work but work on other projects include Daniel Eaton, Andrew Gibson, and John Secante. Really, we were blessed to have funding from the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, enormously thankful for their support. And I could not do what I'm doing without really the very strong support of the R&D service at the St. Louis VA, specifically Susan Wood and Aaron Olson. I want to say their name because these are the people who really keep me going. That's very important, and their support is absolutely wonderful. And the director of the Veterans Affairs and Veterans Research and Education Foundation, Ali Schaefer, absolutely amazing. So our work gets a lot of sort of media attention, specifically because of the work of these two people, Christina and Diane. Christina Sauerstein and then Diane Williams. They're absolutely amazing. They do a lot of work to try to get the word out, educate the public about the consequences of SARS-CoV-2 infection and long COVID. Christina and most of our press releases, and we've done a lot over the course of this pandemic, more than, I don't know, like 20, 30 press releases over the course of the past 3-4 years. Almost 90% of them are written by Christina. Diane is sort of engages with the media externally and helps disseminate the word. So again, thank you very much for the opportunity to present here, and I would really be delighted to do a Q&A.
Ziyad, thank you very much. One of the things, and I alluded to it at the beginning, that so much of the subliminal thread has to do with numbers, extraordinary numbers. Whether it's the talking about cohorts of millions of people. I mean, I've never heard of cohorts of millions of people before the work that you've been involved in, and that led to this work today. To that observation that is at its first glance hard to grasp, that the majority, even though the more severe your disease, the much more likely you are to get long COVID, the majority of long COVID cases today come from mild disease because of the extraordinary numbers. And you'll see a lot of COVID caution being taken today, for example, in this very well-ventilated space and with all the mask wearers that's there. Just before I came here, I saw a current estimate for how many cases of COVID there are today. This is US. Hard now because we don't test. You have to do some calculations based on wastewater management and so on. And we're now nearing, the estimate in the US is we're now nearing 1 million cases a day, COVID. And the similar proportional numbers, population of 330 million people, population of Australia of 26 million, you can basically do that maths. We're a little bit behind on the scale of the current outbreak. So what it means is that one of the big differences to the flu and things is that almost every person, certainly every family, gets exposed to COVID, and a very large proportion of the population get exposed every wave. So what we just saw isn't relevant to just the past and how we treat those with long COVID. This repeat infection thing is very, very real. So with that as a precursor, this is now open to questions from the audience. Are there any? Peter first, and then over here.
Yes, that was great. No, we've all been reading your work and admiring it. But a key issue, seems to me, is whether or not there is viral persistence in long COVID, and we don't really know that, as far as I'm concerned. And we do know that if people die acutely from very severe COVID, or even more slowly from ICU, that there's a wonderful University of Maryland series showing that this virus is everywhere. But we don't know that for long COVID. So I wonder, with the enormous resources of the US, whether there's any serious effort to try and take, say, road accident victims, people who die unexpectedly when young, may or may not have long COVID, but actually look by post-mortem to see if we can find virus in such people. Because as we all know, the incidence of post-mortems has dropped dramatically as we use imaging techniques and so forth. But it would be a wonderful opportunity, rather grim and macabre though it is, if we could actually organise that on a national level. And the US is one of the few places that could do it.
Well, thank you for this. This is really a wonderful, wonderful question. So there was one study that was done at the NIH where they did 41 autopsy studies of people who had SARS-CoV-2 infection and subsequently died months later from other causes, car accidents or other causes months later. And they actually showed that they were able to retrieve the virus from not only the lung, but also extrapulmonary tissue, including the appendix and other tissues. But I think the question that you're asking is really, really important. Are those really live viruses that are able to replicate? And I think we don't know that yet. So I think that the key is whether you can recover viral fragments, several weeks or several months after the initial infection. The answer to that seems to be yes, from the studies that we've seen. But I think that what's debatable, we don't really know for sure whether the virus persists in a form that actually still replicates in the body weeks or months after the initial infection. I personally doubt it, but I definitely, as a scientist, I would want to see data. And as you point out, the data does not really exist yet. So Glenn Chernow, I will be happy to share, it was published in Nature about a year ago, in Nature, yeah.
Thank you.
It's a group at NIH, really wonderful group at NIH, and actually really hard to do these studies because you have to find these cases and then do the autopsy studies and all of that, and it's a really very, very nice work and showing. And most importantly, the revelation for us is really the extrapulmonary, right? Like we would expect to see it in respiratory tissue, wasn't really like much of a revelation to us, but the extrapulmonary involvement and the presence, let's say, in kidney tissue and the appendix and really various places of the body was an aha moment for me. But the big question is whether are they truly replicating viruses or just fragments sitting there, residual from a from an infection several months ago. That is 100% correct. That is 100% correct. So flu is certainly more of a respiratory illness. Absolutely correct. Actually, we have a paper coming out on December 12th. We're actually saying exactly that. Flu is more of a respiratory illness. SARS-CoV-2 is more of a multisystemic illness. That's for sure. And I think one of the things that contribute to that is the viremia, but not only that, but also characteristics related to the spike protein and the ACE2 receptors and a so-called tropism, right? So there are a lot of things about SARS-CoV-2 that makes it multisystemic. But very, very clearly from the epi data that we see, very, very clearly that when you compare COVID versus flu, So very, very clearly, flu is actually a respiratory virus. They called it respiratory virus 100 years ago, and it's true. It's true. SARS-CoV-2, the R in SARS is not is for respiratory, but it's a multisystemic virus for sure. And as you point out accurately, the viremia is one of the distinguishing characteristics or the differences between COVID and the flu.
Question.
Hello, my name is Bruce. I wanted to touch on a question which came to me when you were talking about your earlier studies, and the risk of long COVID doesn't seem to be related to age. And this is more a question which Brendan might be able to help with because it's the Australian context. The Australian Advisory Group, if you're under 60 in Australia, you don't have access to a fifth or more vaccine, and you don't have access to antivirals. Both of these could reduce the severity of COVID in those under 60. And I'm just wondering whether the ATAGI, the Australian group, is taking long COVID into consideration when they're making recommendations, and also that once recommendations are made, that determines availability regardless of whether you want to even pay for it yourself. You just cannot get it if you're under 60. So I just wanted to put that question to you.
So personally, I advocate for vaccines for all, and I think this is the question that was also raging in the US before the vaccines were approved for everyone and above 6 months old in the US. And I wanted to but before the decision was made, I gave an interview to Science magazine, basically advocating for vaccines for all. It was very heavily criticized, but for this, but was very sort of very happy to see that the U.S. fell on the right side of history here when the committee responsible for approving vaccines approved it for everyone who is above 6 months of age. And the major factor that swayed them in that direction is actually precisely long COVID. So vaccines work. Vaccines reduce the risk of severe disease. Obviously, severe disease is more common in older adults, right? The risk of hospitalization and death is more common in older adults, but that doesn't mean the risk is zero in younger adults or kids. And add to that, on top of that, the risk of long COVID. So from our perspective, the math is very, very clear. If this is really about achieving maximum public health protection, then the math is very, very clear that vaccines ought to be provided to everyone who is more than 6 months of age. That's my thinking.
Yes, I can't add too much more than that, except to say they clearly use a different criteria. The answer to your question is no. ATAGI don't consider long COVID worth protecting by vaccines at the moment. It's not the only thing. The strategy is to protect vulnerable people, in inverted commas, from acute disease, but actually identifying all of those is not easy either. So there's multiple reasons why a wider eligibility, from my perspective, is desirable, and that's what the US has. Are there other questions from the audience? Yes, one over there and then one down here.
My name is Robert. I don't know anything about I should say I'm a lawyer, so I don't know anything about what was being said this evening, but thank you for your presentation. Can you tell me what brain fog is? That seems to be a rather vague comment, or can you tell me about that?
Sure. So it's a colloquial term. It's generally refers to. So we don't use the term brain fog in the medicine literature, but it's a colloquial term. This is what patients really generally refer to it. They refer to brain fog when they're describing a state when they're not able to recall things, remember where things are, remember where they left the keys. When it's sort of like basically, hazy memory or actually, I think that the term is very describes the state of things very, it's like a brain fog. It's I don't know how to describe it. It's a brain haziness, inability to recall things, impaired executive function, so things of this nature. Did I explain it correctly, or?
Yes. Would long COVID be a cause of dementia or Alzheimer's, or would it cause those diseases to develop?
This is really a wonderful question. So mechanistically, what we think is really, very clearly like there's brain inflammation that's really happening. So there's a lot of work that has been done by Michel Mange at Stanford and others, really looking at sort of the brain of mice who are, given SARS-CoV-2, and very clearly we see brain inflammation. So the brain gets inflamed after SARS-CoV-2 infection. And then actually in autopsy studies of humans, the same thing is really happening. And imaging studies, people have been able to also document structural abnormalities of the brain following SARS-CoV-2 infection. So it's very clear that there may be a lot of things happening in the brain following the infection that may explain the neurologic manifestations, including the brain fog, including the memory problem or memory loss. Another way to sort of think about brain fog is memory problems. Memory problems, recalling things, are memory problems. Now, does SARS-CoV-2 infection lead to increased risk of Alzheimer's disease? The answer is that there are some studies showing this, but I would like to caution a little bit about how do we interpret this. Alzheimer's disease per se, or dementia, true dementia, actually takes a long time to manifest. People don't really, they're fine today and they wake up tomorrow and they have Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is really a process, a degenerative disease that takes a long time to manifest. So I think when people sort of show studies where COVID-19 can lead to increased risk of Alzheimer's disease, I think what they're really showing is that the person was going to develop Alzheimer's disease anyway, but then COVID accelerated the progression of the underlying pathology and sort of tipped them over the edge. So for example, instead of like them developing Alzheimer's disease at age 80, now they develop at age 78 or 77. So you can think of it as an accelerant. It's unlikely to be the only factor that's going to lead to this degenerative neurologic disorder, right? But if you sort of conceptualize it as a multi-hit problem, that they've got, like, let's say, if what they need is like 4 hits, and they had 3 before, and then COVID is the 4th one, bingo. They have now all what they need to actually, go down the path of developing clinically recognizable Alzheimer's disease. Does that make sense? So this is how we think about it. We don't really think as that it's really on its own, a sufficient risk factor and on its own to lead to Alzheimer's disease. But we think on a background of high risk for Alzheimer's disease could actually accelerate the development of underlying pathology to lead to clinical Alzheimer's disease sooner than later. Yeah.
Okay, Alan, I'm curious about the age relationship with long COVID. You showed us that older adults and younger adults, but what about primary school kids and secondary school kids? Do they get long COVID?
Well,
and if they don't, is there some magic age at which the risk goes up that would give us some clues as to the underlying mechanism?
This is an absolutely beautiful question. Thank you for asking this. So I focused my story on adults, but I think it's very important. So thank you for asking this, because we shouldn't really forget children. Anybody can get long COVID. Anybody. So people can get long COVID when they're 5 years old, 6 years old can get long COVID. And I had in my email about it a year ago, somebody telling me about a daughter telling me about her dad, who's 101 years old veteran who had long COVID, right? So people, it can affect people across the age spectrum, from younger, like really young people to older adults. Now, the manifestations may differ by age. Like your kids don't really, come to you and say, I have brain fog, right? Like an adult, or if you talk to a patient who has long COVID, she or he may tell you that they have brain fog. Kids don't really say they have brain fog. It actually manifests in school grades. Parents start thinking, seeing their kids coming back home with different grades than they used to before, right? Or performance in sports, right? So they cannot do they cannot sort of play the way they played before they got the infection. So it manifests differently in kids, but it certainly can happen. Long COVID can happen in kids, and they should definitely not be forgotten. And I'm thankful that you asked this question because it's very, very important to highlight that.
There's a question over there. Michelle might follow up, I suspect.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Ziyad. My name is Michelle Schooler. I'm a paediatrician and work at Burnet as well. I have a comment and a question. The first comment was just about the brain fog. I've heard it described as more than just memory issues. It's like trying to think through mud. It's not that you can't just remember something, it's that the process of the thought can't continue and can't eventuate, like a cogwheel that won't align itself as it's trying to turn. So I think it's more than memory issues, and certainly that shows in assessments of people who describe brain fog that it doesn't show up in the traditional assessments used that focus primarily on memory. My other comment is thank you for calling out that we shouldn't forget the children. I'm a paediatrician and I say that repeatedly, as I said earlier today, and especially thank you for pointing out and making the case for vaccines for all, especially for children 6 months and over. Thank you for pointing out your data that has shown that it is of benefit to them, and for their own health, not only to protect others, but to protect themselves. And lastly, my question is about, I wondered if you could comment perhaps on when you were talking about mechanisms for long COVID and the recent paper that came out around serotonin deficiency and how SARS-CoV-2 seems to have a longer impact on serotonin depletion, and how that might perhaps link with the gut dysbiosis, given that's where the reservoirs often are. Thank you.
Well, thank you for all of that, and thank you for the comments, and certainly really very, very nice data recently on serotonin, sort of linking gut dysbiosis and deficiency in the production of serotonin to subsequent clinical phenotypes or disease of long COVID. And I think that's really very, very interesting. It's compelling data. What I really think we need to see whether actually this really translates into potential avenue for therapeutics, whether SSRIs or things that could potentially elevate serotonin levels would rescue the phenotype, would really sort of help ameliorate symptoms of long COVID, and that really remains to be seen. I know a lot of people were really, really excited about that finding, and then immediately took it like, oh, we need to do this trial, That's really great. This is what we want. We want people to do more trials to help us understand what works, what doesn't. This is how science works, right? This is the only way in science you have to do the experiment. You don't know the answer before you do the experiment. You have to do the science to understand what works and what doesn't. And that's really the only way we learn. We have to design a really good experiment to try to allow us to understand whether serotonin replacement or beefing up serotonin levels would improve outcomes in people with long COVID. But the data is very compelling, absolutely compelling.
And two questions. Two quick questions from the back. Thank you. And then we'll wrap it up.
Hello, thank you so much for that wonderful talk. I'm a research scientist working in infectious disease, but not long COVID. And I was wondering, you've talked across a broad range of symptoms for patients with long COVID. Is there a consensus on how you define long COVID to enrol patients into studies? Or does that remain quite broad as well?
So this is really a wonderful question. I alluded to it in my presentation. One of the major sort of obstacles that big pharma actually tells us when we talk to them is that really there is no consensus on the definition. There is no consensus on clinical outcomes or clinical endpoints. Most importantly, they would want, before they invest money in a trial, that the regulators are going to really agree that these endpoints are really important, right? Agree on the phenotype for enrollment, and then on the endpoints that are actually valid, their measurement is valid, and then showing an improvement in these endpoints is going to subsequently lead to approval of the drug by the regulators. I think we're working in that direction. I don't think we're there yet. As I said, one of the the beauty and the challenges in this field is really embryonic. This is truly embryonic disease. We did not really know anything about long COVID 40 years ago. We did not know anything about long COVID 4 years ago, right? So all of this in the span of four short years, right? So I think we're pushing toward a more consensus definition. The National Academy of Medicine in the US has actually now a committee working on developing a definition. There are a lot of other people who sort of are working to try to, agree on a common set of endpoints for clinical trials to facilitate the conduct of clinical trials. And I know that regulators are and big pharma are also sort of hopefully they're about to meet and to come to an understanding what are the most important clinical endpoints to target for clinical trials.
Thank you.
But this is a very, very important question. It's actually one of the major things that need to be solved to facilitate more clinical trials. Facilitate the conduct of more clinical trials.
Thanks, Brendan. Another Bruce. Very quick point. Exercise. We're told, for ageing, recovery, strategic exercise is important. Everything you talked about with long COVID seems like it's counterintuitive, but is there a role?
Yeah, so I think this is a very hot issue. This is a very, 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 very hot issue. And so I'd say that I would replace that with the word pacing. Physical activity with pacing is probably the right thing to try to see if that can actually improve or ameliorate outcomes in so pacing protocols. I think one of the major, I didn't touch upon this here, but one of the major things that people with long COVID actually complain about is what we call post-exertional malaise, PEM. And that's really what that is. So for those of you who don't really know, is it's really this feeling of complete exhaustion, like complete depletion after exertion. They do minimal exertion. They go and pick up their son from school, and they come back, and they're totally depleted for days, and it takes them days to recover, right? So yes, physical activity is generally healthy, but for people with long COVID, especially for people with PEM or post-exertional malaise, it could set them back, days or weeks, or in some cases actually even months. So I think pacing is really the key word here, to try to do what your body can tolerate, but not more, and very, 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 very gradually inch that up to try to see if you could move forward in that trajectory. There are protocols for this. This is really very, very important thing, because PEM or post-exertional malaise is a really, really, really profoundly deleterious. And also the psychological consequences of PEM. They have this PEM, and they are back in bed for days or weeks, and that really is very, very, very is very hard for them to deal with, and I definitely understand that.
And so the very last question goes to me, Ziyad, before I wrap up. You very nicely showed that we have to get the numbers down. We have to apply the tools we have much more effectively. I suspect, though, that even with all that, which we must have, we're still going to need, some different tools, some new tools, and you talked about the zero therapies there. What is the vision for that? Is it a going to the moon in the 1960s type challenge? Is it a decade away? Is it around the corner? What's it going to take to have a pill or, a week's course or something we can tell to cure our long COVID? I know that's an impossible question in a way, but we speak to policymakers all the time. We're trying to give some sort of framework for them to operate in for what the degree of the challenge is to get that pill.
Well, thank you for that. This is really an important question, and sort of leaves me with a lot of hope that we can sort of all sort of galvanize interest and work synergistically to address problems. So I really think like long COVID is a serious problem, and it requires a solution that is proportionate to the problem, that it should not be undersized or should not be oversized. But because it's a big problem, it really requires a coherent and really very ambitious global health agenda to try to move things in the right direction. In the US, we've called, several, actually now more than 2 years ago for a long COVID moonshot. And actually, I would first, to give you a little bit of a snippet, our first name for the National Research Action Plan on Long COVID in the US was actually the Long COVID Moonshot, but it was changed. You knew that?
No, I didn't.
Okay, so it was actually the Long COVID Moonshot, but then it was scaled down, and I think we need a similar approach, and we not only in the U.S. but in the U.S. I keep telling them this is an all hands on deck situation. This is really truly an all hands on deck situation. It's going to require also all hands on deck in Australia, in the UK, in New Zealand, in Europe, in Germany, and elsewhere in the European continent to really achieve that progress. And people deserve it and need it yesterday, and really we must deliver. This is very, very, very important, and we must deliver.
All right. So now all that remains is for me, on behalf of us all, on behalf of all of the staff of the Institute, of the students of the Institute, of the board, and great to see Burnet board members here today, of all our supporters and donors and family, and our colleagues, especially in our new partnership with the Doherty Institute and the University of Melbourne, where we're joining forces because of the pandemic in a kind of never again project that will see Burnet relocate to physically be with the Doherty and Melbourne University, literally in the same building. On behalf of all of us, Ziyad, can I say thank you for what was a tour de force in the power of data, incredible data, science, and communication. You have to generate the information, and then you have to communicate it so beautifully in those papers to the scientific community, and then to the rest of the community. And I notice you spend a lot of time acknowledging your colleagues at St Louis Uni at WashU for the work they do in communicating your story. Please pass on to your colleagues, to them, but especially to your EPI group, how much we respect and admire their work, how grateful we are, and I know on behalf of the world's community. We have a big problem with long COVID, as you ended this talk with, but it is that much more manageable because of the work of you and your team. Thank you, and congratulations for all you've achieved.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. It was an honor. Yeah, and a little gift from us. Well, thank you.